"Give the Beatles a rest, old man." The shout came from a table near the center of the restaurant, and the laughter that followed was immediate. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. The 72-year-old man sitting near the wall lowered his eyes to the battered acoustic guitar across his knees. His name was Walter Brennan. His coat was worn at the elbows, his boots were splitting at the seams, and beside his chair sat a faded backpack containing nearly everything he owned. For a moment, Walter stopped playing. Then he quietly moved his fingers back to the opening chord of Let It Be. "Sorry," he murmured. "I need to get this one right." That brought another laugh. The restaurant manager crossed the floor. "Sir, that's enough. You've played the same song 3 times. Walter looked up. "Can I finish it once? You already finished it." Walter's expression changed. "No," he said softly, "I haven't." And then he looked at the empty wooden chair beside him. That was when the front door opened. A tall, older man in a dark navy jacket stepped inside with a companion. Nobody at the laughing table noticed him. Neither did Walter. But the newcomer heard the song. He stopped. Paul McCartney had walked into a restaurant where a room full of strangers was laughing at a 72-year-old man for struggling through one of the most famous Beatles songs ever written. And what happened next began with something even stranger. Paul didn't walk toward Walter. Not yet. He stood near the entrance and watched as Walter turned that empty chair several inches toward himself, almost as though someone were sitting in it. Then Walter started the song again. His first chord buzzed. Someone chuckled. His second was worse. But Walter kept going, and Paul suddenly noticed something tied around the headstock of the battered guitar. Something old, something faded, something that looked completely out of place. His face changed, because Walter wasn't trying to entertain that restaurant. He wasn't even playing for the people laughing at him. And before the night was over, everyone in that room would understand why he had been unable to finish the same song for 29 years. But to understand that, you have to go back to the first person Walter ever promised to play it for. 29 years earlier, Walter Brennan's hands looked very different. They were still rough, still scarred around the knuckles, but they belonged to a man who spent 10 hours a day repairing heating systems across London and came home every evening to the same small apartment, the same woman, and usually the same Beatles record spinning in the living room. Her name was Margaret. She had been Walter's wife for 31 years, and she loved Let It Be with an enthusiasm Walter pretended to find unbearable. "One day, you're going to wear that record flat," he would complain. Margaret would smile and turn it slightly louder. Their daughter Emily had grown up watching this argument repeat itself. She knew her father secretly loved the song because whenever Margaret played it, Walter somehow found a reason to remain in the room. Walter was not an expressive man. He fixed leaking pipes, remembered birthdays, checked the locks twice before bed, and put fuel in Margaret's car before she noticed it was empty. Those were his love letters. Saying what he felt was harder. Then Margaret became ill. Hospital appointments replaced Sunday walks. Medication bottles appeared beside the kettle. Walter responded the only way he knew how. He tried to fix everything, but this was the first problem his hands could not repair. One afternoon, Emily arrived carrying a battered second-hand acoustic guitar. Walter stared at it. "What am I supposed to do with that?" "I've never played a note." "Then learn one note." Emily placed the guitar in his hands and glanced toward Margaret's Beatles record. Walter understood immediately. He began practicing in secret. At first, Let It Be barely sounded recognizable. His fingertips hurt. The chords buzzed. He repeatedly forgot where his fingers belonged. But every night, after Margaret fell asleep, Walter sat in the kitchen with the door closed and tried again. He had a plan. Their 32nd wedding anniversary was 6 weeks away. For once, instead of repairing something, buying something, or hiding behind a joke, Walter would sit in front of his wife and play the song she had filled their home with for decades. Margaret never knew, and Walter never imagined that 6 weeks was time they didn't have. Because 17 days before their anniversary, the telephone rang before sunrise. By the time Walter reached the hospital, the guitar was lying forgotten beneath his kitchen table, and the promise he had been practicing every night was already running out of time. Walter reached St. Anne's Hospital just after 6 in the morning. Margaret had deteriorated during the night. By the time he entered her room, the woman who had filled their home with music looked impossibly small beneath the white sheets. Emily was already there. For the next 2 days, Walter barely left the hospital. He adjusted Margaret's pillows, fetched water she hardly touched, and asked nurses questions whose answers he already knew. He kept searching for something he could do, because doing nothing meant accepting what was happening. Then, on the second evening, Emily remembered the guitar. "Dad," she whispered in the corridor, "bring it tomorrow." Walter looked at her. "She doesn't know. That's the point." The following morning, Walter carried the battered guitar into the hospital. Margaret was asleep. He placed it against the wall and waited. Hours passed. Twice she woke. Twice Walter nearly reached for it. Both times fear stopped him. He had imagined playing at home on their anniversary, with Margaret laughing when he missed a chord. He had never imagined playing beside a hospital bed while wondering whether every breath might be her last. Near midnight, Margaret opened her eyes and saw the guitar. "What's that doing here?" Walter forced a smile. "Long story. You play now?" "Apparently." Margaret gave the faintest laugh. Walter reached toward the guitar. Then his hand stopped. He couldn't do it. Later, a nurse handed Walter a small plastic bag containing her belongings. Inside were her ring, a watch, and the hospital identification band that had been removed from their wrist. Walter stared at that band for a long time. That night, he tied it around the headstock of the guitar. But the worst moment came 2 days later. Emily found him sitting alone at the kitchen table. "Did you play Mom her song?" Walter should have told the truth. Instead, grief and shame answered first. "Yeah." Emily's face crumpled. She wrapped both arms around him. "I knew she'd love it." Walter closed his eyes. He had lied in 5 seconds. He would carry those 5 seconds for 29 years. After the funeral, he tried to play Let It Be alone. He made it through most of the song before his fingers stopped at the same place they had always feared reaching, the ending. He tried again weeks later, then on Margaret's birthday, then on their anniversary. Every time, Walter stopped. Eventually it became a ritual nobody knew about. One battered guitar, one faded hospital band, one song, and an ending Walter could never reach. But the lie he told Emily would cost him far more than the song ever did. In the months after Margaret's death, Walter became very good at disappearing without going anywhere. He still went to work. He still paid bills. He still answered the telephone when Emily called. But the man who came home every evening was quieter than the one who had left that morning. Margaret's records remained beside the stereo untouched. Her coffee mug stayed in the cupboard, and the guitar remained against the bedroom wall with the faded hospital band tied around its headstock. Emily tried to reach him. At first, she came every Sunday, then every other Sunday. She brought groceries, photographs, stories from work, anything that might make her father speak about something other than boilers and weather. Walter loved seeing her. That was exactly why he began avoiding her. Every time Emily mentioned Margaret, he remembered the lie. "I knew she'd love it." 4 words Emily had spoken while hugging him. 4 words Walter had never corrected. Eventually, Emily stopped asking about the song. Walter somehow found that worse. Years passed. His maintenance company closed. Temporary jobs replaced permanent work. His savings thinned. The apartment he had shared with Margaret became too expensive, then disappeared altogether. Walter moved into rented rooms, then cheaper rooms, carrying fewer possessions each time. The guitar always came with him, and once every year, on the anniversary he had intended to play for Margaret, Walter took it out. He would begin Let It Be. His playing improved slightly with repetition, but that never mattered, because when he reached the final passage, his fingers stopped. Every year, for 29 years, 3 weeks before his 72nd birthday, something arrived at a temporary hostel where Walter had been staying. A letter. The handwriting belonged to Emily. They had not seen each other in almost 7 years. Walter opened it, standing beside his narrow bed. There were no accusations, no long explanations. Only a place, a time, and one sentence. "I'll meet you tomorrow if you still want to talk." Walter read it 6 times. Tomorrow. For years he had imagined what he would say if Emily ever sat across from him again. Now that she had offered him the chance, Walter discovered something terrifying. He could not face his daughter while still protecting the lie that had helped push them apart. So that evening, he took the guitar and walked across London. He ended up outside a restaurant he had not entered in decades. The name above the door had changed. The owners had changed. The neighborhood barely resembled his memory. But through the window, Walter recognized the corner. In 1965, when he and Margaret had almost no money, they had eaten there during their first weekend together in London. Margaret had sat in a wooden chair near the wall and spent half the evening feeding Walter pieces from her plate because he had ordered something he hated and was too stubborn to admit it. The restaurant was still quiet. He asked the manager for 10 minutes. Then he chose 2 chairs. He sat in one. He placed the other beside him and turned it slightly toward the guitar. At first, nobody paid attention. Then the dinner crowd arrived. Walter began playing. He reached the ending, stopped, started again. A customer laughed. Walter tried a 3rd time. Someone raised a phone to record him. Another voice called, "Give the Beatles a rest, old man." Walter lowered his head. The manager approached. "Sir, that's enough." Walter looked at the empty chair. Tomorrow, Emily would be waiting for the truth. Tonight, Walter needed to finish the one thing he had been running from for 29 years. "Can I finish it once?" "You already finished it." Walter shook his head. "No, I haven't." And as the laughter rose again, the restaurant door opened behind him. Walter didn't turn around. He had no idea that Paul McCartney had just walked in. Paul McCartney had come to the restaurant for dinner, not music. He entered with one companion, heard the familiar chords, and stopped before reaching the first table. Walter was attempting Let It Be again. Paul could have recognized those chords through almost anything. But what held him near the doorway wasn't the song. It was the man playing it. Walter's fingers trembled whenever he approached the same passage. Each time, he slowed down as though the next few chords contained something he was afraid to touch. A man at the laughing table noticed Paul first. His smile disappeared. Then another customer turned. Whispers traveled across the restaurant. Walter noticed none of it. Paul did. He also noticed the empty chair. Then his eyes settled on the guitar. Something pale and faded was tied around its headstock. Paul moved closer. "What's that?" he quietly asked the manager. The manager misunderstood. "The guitar? He's been at it all evening." Paul kept watching Walter. "No. How long has he been trying?" The manager frowned. "Too long." Paul finally looked at him. "That's not what I asked." Before the manager could answer, Walter reached the final passage again. His fingers stopped. The restaurant had become almost completely silent. Walter stared at the strings. Paul stepped forward. "Who are you leaving the ending for?" Walter froze. He slowly turned. For several seconds, he simply stared at the man standing a few feet away. Recognition arrived, without excitement. If anything, Walter looked frightened. His eyes moved from Paul to the empty chair. "My wife." Paul glanced toward it. "Where is she?" Walter swallowed. 29 years too late. Nobody laughed now. Paul looked again at the faded hospital band tied to the guitar, then at Walter's weathered hands. The crowd expected the obvious thing. Paul McCartney would take the guitar. He would play the song correctly. He would turn an awkward restaurant performance into something extraordinary. Instead, Paul walked past the guitar. He reached for the empty chair. Walter suddenly stood. "Please don't move that." Paul stopped. "Was this hers?" Walter nodded. Paul gently returned it to exactly where it had been. Then, unexpectedly, he sat down in it. Walter's face changed. Paul leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "What's her name?" "Margaret." Paul nodded toward the guitar. "And don't play it for me." Walter looked around the restaurant. Every face that had been laughing was now watching him. His hands began shaking again. "I don't think I can finish it." Paul didn't touch the instrument. He didn't offer to play. He simply looked at Walter and said, "Then forget everyone in this room." A pause. "Finish it for Margaret." Walter slowly sat back down, and for the first time that night, the 72-year-old man wasn't afraid of playing the wrong note. He was afraid of finally reaching the last one. Walter placed his fingers on the strings. The first chord buzzed. Nobody laughed. He started again, slowly. His voice was rough, his timing imperfect, but something had changed. He was no longer looking at the crowd. He was looking at Paul, sitting in Margaret's empty chair. Halfway through the song, Paul quietly began tapping the rhythm against his knee. Nothing more. No takeover. No rescue. Walter kept playing. Then he reached the passage that had defeated him for 29 years. His hand stopped. Silence filled the restaurant. Paul said nothing. Walter looked at Margaret's faded hospital band tied around the guitar. His eyes closed. Then his fingers moved. One chord, then another. For the first time in 29 years, Walter reached the end. The final note faded. Nobody applauded. Not yet. Walter stared down at the guitar and whispered, "Emily, I lied." Paul leaned forward. Walter explained that his daughter had asked whether he had played the song for Margaret before she died. "I told her I had." His voice broke. "I'm seeing her tomorrow. First time in 7 years. I couldn't sit across from her while that lie was still unfinished." The man who had mocked Walter slowly lowered his phone. Another customer looked away. Paul stood from Margaret's chair. "Tomorrow," he said, "tell your daughter exactly what you just told this room." Walter looked up. "What if I'm too late?" Paul held his gaze, then let her decide that. Only then did the applause begin. The loudest man in the restaurant walked forward and placed money beside Walter's guitar. Walter picked it up and handed it back. Wasn't playing for money. Paul smiled faintly. But Walter still had no idea that the hardest part wasn't finishing Margaret's song. It was sitting across from Emily the next morning and discovering she already knew the truth. The following morning, Walter sat in a small cafe with the battered guitar beside him. Across the table was an empty chair. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Walter began to believe 29 years had finally become too long. A hand touched the back of the chair. "Dad?" Walter looked up. Emily was older now, but for one impossible second he saw the daughter who had hugged him in that kitchen decades earlier. She sat down. Walter didn't make excuses. "I lied to you about your mother." Emily's eyes filled. "I know." Walter stared at her. A nurse had told Emily years earlier that the guitar had remained untouched beside Margaret's hospital bed. "Then why did you come?" Emily reached across the table. "Because you finally came to tell me." There was no instant repair of 7 lost years. But there was coffee, then conversation, and eventually another meeting. Walter never became a musician. He began volunteering at a community music room, helping frightened beginners continue after bad chords. Margaret's hospital band remained tied to his guitar, but he never placed an empty chair beside himself again. Years later, someone asked whether Paul McCartney had taught him how to play Let It Be. Walter smiled. No, he looked down at the battered guitar. He taught me who I needed to finish it for. That restaurant crowd had believed they were laughing at an old man who couldn't finish a Beatles song. They were wrong. For 29 years, Walter hadn't been struggling to finish a song. He had been struggling to finish a goodbye.